Hello, welcome to 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony, joined today by Dr. Hilard Pouncy, sociopolitical researcher, author, speaker, and lecturer. Hilard, good to be with you again. Oh, sorry, I caught you.
The pleasure's all mine, Rick.
Of course it is. I think our last visit together predated the coronavirus. It was a much different world then. Unimaginable that people all over the globe are doing everything they can to avoid being infected by the 21st century plague. And of course, we have the further complication of a bitterly divided country, unrest, civil unrest in most of our major cities, protesters who are making their case for social justice. We seem to be in the vortex of a perfect storm in the history of this great experiment in self-government. What's your take on all of that?
Well, first, let's do first things first. It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
It's good to see that you're safe. I hope your family's safe. Mine is.
Yes, thank you. We are all safe. We are hibernating. It's boring as hell, but we're safe.
Yeah, I have a 100-year-old father in the middle of Georgia, so I guess you can imagine how I feel these days.
Yeah, I know you've been concerned about that.
Right. And, there is a cost to being on your show, Rick. I don't know if you know that.
No, I didn't know that. Certainly not to me.
Well, it was for me. Back in Thanksgiving, we spent the entire holiday at the home of a friend, and we got invited there because his wife had gone online and found out that his grad school buddy was on TV, as she put it. So we got down there, and over Thanksgiving, they wanted to know all about this TV show I was on.
Yes.
They'd heard of 60 Minutes. They were curious about 30 Minutes.
Yes. And?
I tried to explain to them what Wayne's World was. I don't know. I don't think we're going to get to go back, Rick. I think that was the end of it.
But you were a celebrity for a moment or two.
That's the point, Rick. That was the point. It was my famous under backhanded compliment. I think.
Yes. Had they actually seen one of the shows?
That's how we got invited, Rick. This thing had gone.
Which
viral.
show? Do you recall which show it was?
I think they had actually watched all of them.
No kidding.
Rick, there's some things that
these people need a life, Hilard.
I tried to help as best I could, Rick.
That's funny. That's really funny. I think the question most people are asking these days is, what's life going to be like after COVID-19? After we've tamed the vaccine, the virus with a vaccine and other therapeutics, what will life be like? What's the new normal? Everybody keeps talking about the new normal, and there are, as you know, articles and books and shows of all kinds with people pontificating about what life is going to be like as it affects virtually every aspect of our society. You sent me an article recently that you felt was a pretty good treatise on what life is going to be like, and I think that's the basis for today's conversation.
Well, it's the usual thing with a show with you, Rick. The show begins with some structure, some point of reality, and then mayhem ensues. Yeah, this was an article by David Leonhardt of the New York Times, who has a column. I'm blocking on the name of it, something like the morning briefing, something like that. And he did it very well. He did this exercise of imagining the impact of COVID-19 on society writ large, but it boiled down to essentially a straight line projection of how long before normality returns, and depending on when you think things might return to normal, let's for now call it the vaccine, the amount of damage we would have gone through, what would be the lasting effect of it? And his thought had been, well, if it doesn't take very long, then we shouldn't expect to see much of a difference. And if it takes a long time, we should expect to see a lot of difference. That kind of simplistic thinking. And it got me thinking, and I like it when you decide to play along, that Yeah, but nothing in life is linear and straightforward like that. There's always the curveball or the unanticipated. For example, as we went on air this morning, the top of the line article in the New York Times is Pfizer and a small German company are about to get upwards of $100 million because there's some possibility of a vaccine at the end of this year, which would be the very short end of Leonhardt's expectation. But to me, that's an artificial way of talking about the impact of COVID. I think the metaphor I would prefer is a Pandora's box, where we've opened something here, which brings to the fore many of the forces that you and I won't get to see play out, but look like candidates for major forces for the century, right? We're at the beginning of a century. And you're not going to be able to put much of that back into the box. So let's assume the possibility that we've seen what cannot now be unseen. I'll give you some trivial examples, and then we can go for the deep end of the pool if you like. Okay?
That's fine. May I interrupt you with a question?
How dare you? Go right ahead, Rick.
Sorry. This is certainly an extraordinary time for all of us, for the whole globe. How is it substantially different from the World War I, World War II global conflict that disrupted every aspect of life, and then the aftermath of that, when we had a society, a government, and economies like nothing we had ever experienced before? That was pretty traumatic as well. How is this different from the Spanish flu, influenza, and some of the other major events in our history? And what can we learn from that so we can, to some extent, predict the future of this experience?
So I did the research, Rick, so you don't have to.
All right, that I'm relieved.
Yes. As you know, I have a 100-year-old father.
Yes.
Rounding error. He's 97, 98. Yeah.
Yeah.
And all the stuff you mentioned, he lived through. Except World War I. He didn't make it to that. And he's Cynthian. He's still got his mind. And I asked him, I said, hey, big fella, what do you see about the current times that reminds you of the past times, and what doesn't remind you of the past times? And his take on it was he didn't remember the Spanish flu. And I think that's really an urban phenomena, right? You want to have contagion. Yes. You have to have density. But he did remember the Depression, and he, of course, remembered World War II. And of the list that you put out there, he liked the Depression best because he claimed that it triggered these forces that had been building up and then let them, full on. So the idea that a government that had been very much laissez-faire is now brought into the center of things. Innovations are now given permission. Pace of change, I think, is what I would note. I don't think he noted it. But I think the big one he noted was the sense of, oddly enough, we're all in it together. The country could have fallen apart, or the country could have rallied together. And in his mind, it did more of the latter than the former. And that seems to me what Leonhardt misses, which is it's a test of national character we got underway. Yes. And we got the unleashing of certainly forces, permission to up the pace of innovation. And I think, this is usually the moment you say, yeah, but shouldn't we proceed with caution, trust, but evaluate? And the short answer is, of course. But on the other hand, you're in a bad place, and you're only going to get out of it if you don't do what's been normal. So you've got to strike that happy balance. But I think something like this gives us permission to increase the pace of innovation, and the just as we sat down, I have two screens, and as you can see, my eyes are wandering. And as we speak, the federal regulatory authorities are trying to get a vaccine out the door. And that's normally we would be afraid of that. Who's going to put that in their arm with very little testing, for example?
You mentioned something before. You used the Pandora's box analogy. And could it be that depression may have been one a good example of it, maybe even World War II, that there have been bubbling up under the surface some unrest, call it unrest with it, but a desire for something different, a desire for something better. There has been opposition to much of that, and all of a sudden it's been unleashed. Certainly Black Lives Matter, some of the other changes that are being talked about, reform of all kind in every institution. All of that seems to have just burst forward, and we can't control it. There's no valve, there's no throttle. And doesn't that concern you, that too much, too soon, and our inability to deal with it, to adapt to it?
Yeah, no, this is the show, Rick. I think, what are we, 10, 15 minutes into it? And I've put out there something, and now you've run with your hair on fire, I might note. Oh no, this is awful. What are we going to do?
No, I didn't say it was awful. I didn't say it was awful.
Okay, that's true, Rick. I forgive me. I should be more fair. Yes, but this is the dynamic, and that's why I come back. It's not a train wreck, but an actual useful for me dialogue. And so every now and then I actually get sincere and say something I actually mean, and this is one of those moments.
By the way,
let's unpack.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, so let's unpack what we mean in specific terms, so we can gauge how much risk we're actually running. I'll start with a trivial example or two, and then we can move on to the serious ones, which I know are lingering for you and the two people listening. The trivial one would be,
but including your Thanksgiving friends.
I don't know if they want to watch anymore, Rick.
And you better make other plans for this Thanksgiving. Well, you're going to be alone anyway.
So let's start with a trivial example. In the world before the pandemic, I don't know about you, but I'm fascinated by the gadgets, right? The possibility you can get a carton of toothpaste, instead of going to Costco to get it, a drone brings it to the door.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that when they've tested it, especially in certain rural parts of Texas, people would go out and shoot the drone.
Well, that's good sport there.
I don't know why, but let's just say the rollout had been problematic. I think under the current times, when you are looking for trying to get your costs down, looking for safety, pile on the other attributes, you're likely to see the possibility of drone delivery more likely, right? It makes a lot of sense. And it's hard to, on the top of our heads, right, imagine the downside. I guess lack of regulation, maybe not thinking through the intersection of drones and commercial aviation, but you would think those would be things you could work through. The big idea is we need a big idea. It had been around, and now we can imagine a greater need for it. So that's the model we're looking for, okay, on a trivial basis?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but what occurs to me as you were describing it is that at least one group would oppose it because it is eliminating jobs, albeit low-paying jobs. Nonetheless, it eliminates jobs, the people who would otherwise deliver the parcel, the food, whatever it is.
Okay, yes, I get it. And so rather than use the drones for the heavy lifting of looking at something and by walking around it in a complete circle so we understand the risks, etc., let's pick another one, okay? Because how many people are going to lose their jobs because of drones? Well, the drones can't lift heavy packages. You're always going to need the FedEx person to, deliver.
Wait a minute. Who says drones can't lift heavy packages? Maybe that's true now, it won't be true tomorrow, the day after
Okay.
that.
Okay. All right. But what I want to do is I want to move off the sandbar around
Okay.
implementing based on drones, because to me, it's a fairly straightforward, at least short-term thing. Before, companies couldn't imagine doing it at scale,
I
and
agree.
now they can. And then the consequences, you can imagine they would be dealt with, but it's not
Yes.
an immediate, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
we've put a vaccine in the arms of people that's now killing them. That's a
Yeah.
very different kind of risk. So let's look at something with a little bit more risk to it, but is also a product, shall we say, of the current times. Okay.
All right. You have one in mind, or can I throw one out?
I
Of
certainly
course
do.
you do.
Okay, so let's use racial justice and the protest over police conduct, shall we?
Yes.
Okay. In my look at that, I saw a couple of different things. One, there's something that's close to your heart, the effects of demography. The Gen Zers are a very different kettle of fish. And if you throw into the mix the Gen Xers and baby boomers, the arena of social justice, racial justice, seems to bring those kinds of issues to the fore. Some people in the old days, right, when you and I had hair, it would have been quite disturbed at urban unrest. You remember the late 60s,
Yes.
violence on the streets.
Yes.
It propelled, frankly, the political careers of people like Richard Nixon, the so-called backlash. Now, it doesn't seem to have the same effect. We can quibble, but I'm trying to put a thesis on the table so we can discuss. So bear with me just for a few more minutes. Can you do that?
I'll try. Go ahead.
Okay, so you have in play some demographic forces which have been bubbling beneath the surface, now visible. Okay.
Yep.
And the second part of this, it's going to take a stretch, but I think it'll work. So just bear with me. The second way of thinking about social justice is that, for our purposes, I'm going to use the Philadelphia Inquirer to make this case. I know it's a stretch. I'm asking you to keep 2 or 3.
I'm waiting. I'm waiting.
Okay. The Inquirer has just had a palace coup, as you may or may not know.
Yes, I know.
Okay, for the one person watching your show who doesn't know, I'll summarize. Recently, the Inquirer had its executive editor step down in part because diversity the paper's minority staffers felt that they had not been treated well, something like that. I may be mischaracterizing it.
There was also a headline, an article.
Yes,
that's what precipitated it.
Yes, that's a telling detail. Thank you. Yes, let's assume for that. Now, I've been monitoring the Inquirer since that happened, and and this is just my impression. It is not based on any sort of fact, just an impression. But having been in a newsroom, and my thoughts go like this: that there's a moment when a newspaper undergoes a change. Let's be sweeping about it and call it a generational change. And if you look at the Inquirer today, especially the regional section, there are quite a number of stories highlighting the concerns of the social justice movement, the racial justice movement, stories about people that I suspect the writers think had been invisible in the city before. Literally, people of color are more prominently covered in the paper. And yet, at the other story in the news locally, the large-scale violence, particularly in neighborhoods of color. And those stories are not being covered, at least to my mind, as they're not being covered sufficiently. So the paper has had a change in its staffing and its views, and there's stories now that are prominent, and rightly so, let's assume, but also stories that are being demoted to some extent. And what I'm getting out of that, what I'm building up out of that is, in this new arena, triggered in part by COVID and but other forces as well. There's the black middle class, the great American black middle class, of whom I'm a proud member, are coming into their own. I'm just going to cut to the chase on this hypothesis, and we can note its crudeness, etc. But just as has happened for most major American ethnic groups, there comes a moment when the broad middle of the group, its great middle class, come into positions of responsibility, authority, etc., leadership. And this, in my opinion, is what's happening for African Americans in even in greater numbers. It's been happening for a while. We've talked about it on your show previously, but now it's on front and center. And in doing this, you have you've unleashed a social force, right? It's a new generation of leadership. But the problem in going on with that is you still got issues of inequality, social justice, and other concerns. And the question is, well, how's that now going to be addressed? And my view goes something like this. It's not well thought through, but let's give it a shot. It's one thing to talk about bad policing and social injustice when you're outside pointing inside to a house. But when it's your house, when you now own it, when it's your baby, as they say, parents don't act like that with their kids once they take them home, right? There's a famous story. The parent has to go to school. Principal tells them, your kid's been acting out. The parent defends the kid. But when they get home, the parent holds the kid accountable. So my view is that the forces that are being unleashed are bringing into power new groups of new voices. And when they now have to start taking responsibility, that's what strikes me as really interesting. What will happen next? In other words,
when are they going to step up? When are they going to step up? When are they going to provide at least a counterpoint to the stridency on the other side?
That's my point. That's where we are right now.
What's it going to take to make that happen? It has nothing to do with COVID.
Well, I think COVID has opened the door to rapid social change, new groups, new voices, et cetera, changings of the guard. I don't know if they're happening at the same time, whether there's some causal link.
Hilard, give me one example.
I just did, Rick.
No, give me one example of a Black leader or a group of Black leaders who have come forward and said, wait a minute, we've got to calm down because we're not going to achieve our objectives the way we're going about it.
Oh, yeah. No, the point is that that's now teed up. I mean, at some point, it will have to be noted and it will have to be done. In the first flush of...
Yeah, but wait a minute. The house may have burned down by the time somebody says, wait, we should have stepped up.
Well, those are possibilities, Rick. And the point is to get issues put on the table rather than provide perfect answers. But in my mind, yes, this is where we are. The possibilities, the bringing. I'm stuck, and I'm hoping that I can clean myself up in brief terms. But what I would point out is, yeah, if you've once you've won a revolution, taking responsibility is the next step. And you could put it in a succinct way, which for some reason I couldn't, which is, well, when is that going to happen? And the short answer is, I would assume it will happen. It hasn't happened yet.
Okay. That will make an interesting topic for another discussion. But let's come back, please, to what will life be like in the time we have left after COVID. And let's talk about one area in which you are an expert because you lived in the academic community for such a long time, and that's education, the impact on education. And you know, as well as I, perhaps better than I, that the predictions are that scores of small and medium-sized colleges, both private and public around the country, will close, that there will be massive consolidations, that the further additional impact of online learning will change the character and perhaps the value of continuing education in this country. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we have something like 3,000 to 4,000 colleges in this country. We could lose 500. I wouldn't think we'll lose 1,000, and that would make a headline. That
Yeah.
still leaves 3,000 to 3,500 colleges.
But maybe we only need 1,000.
I didn't say that.
I said maybe we only need 1,000.
Yeah, but we don't know the answer to that. We don't know how many we need. And so the countervailing possibility is if you find that you want a permanent change in education so that the possibilities of online learning are more fully integrated. There are
Yes.
two ways that could go. With one way, you would have very large classes, many fewer professors, and you wouldn't need as much physical space to operate.
Right.
And if you had a measure that showed that you were just as effective, I could imagine that possibility winning. But the other possibility is with online learning, you actually need more faculty because you can produce smaller classes, more
Yeah.
effective classes,
Yes.
and you might even need more physical space for it. So sure, you may not see the continuity of all universities in the same way, but I would think you might be able to forecast an expansion in the education system with an increase in quality as well, just a possibility.
Should Harvard's tuition still be $50,000 for an online degree?
Actually, what Harvard does, because my son teaches at
I
this.
know.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? You know, how did that? I don't see the connection there. My understanding is they do it in two tracks. They charge $50,000 for the people who have access to the professor, and they give away the online class to the rest of the world, but you don't have access to the professor. I don't know if that's the model they'll be able to keep, but you are literally able to have your cake, and then some of you had to pay for it.
Yeah. You know, if we had time, and perhaps this is another show, also like to talk about the effect of COVID and all of the ramifications that some of which we've touched on the economy and on politics. I understand you're not an economist, but you understand the social fabric of economics and the impact of economics on society and various strata of society. We don't have the time to do that because I'm getting a signal. We only have about a minute left. Anything you want to share with us to wrap it up?
Well, first off, I thank you again. I'm glad to hear that you're safe and all's well with you and yours. I'm sorry I got wound up on a thought that I'd had in a shower or two. But this
You have to stop taking showers. Don't do that.
So anyway, but I love this show because it allows people like me to put ideas out there and then get them right.
Yeah, and we always have the opportunity to correct that.
Sure, Rick. Yeah, I'm sure. I'd love to see that happen at some point on your show. Look, this is thank you. This is what do they call it? The opening act. Several more topics and threads. Yeah. I wish I could have something pithy to say to wrap it up for you, but I don't, so I won't.
Okay. Well, as always, I do appreciate the opportunity to spar with you. It's always great fun. And I know that out of it comes something to think about, truly, something to think about. Maybe not for very long or by many people, but maybe your Thanksgiving group will find something in this. Until next time, this is 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony, and my guest today has been Dr. Hilard Pouncy. Take very good care of yourselves. Be safe.